early in the morning. On Sunday, February 17th, 2008, a man was walking with his dog when he suddenly noticed that the dog was attracted to something strange on the ground. Looking closely, he realized it was a series of drops forming a path. He began to follow them, moving parallel to the canal not far from Lambertard, France. The drops continued, leading him to the very shore where he noticed a body half submerged in the water. It was swollen and very pale. The man immediately reported it to the police. In the name of law enforcement, forensic experts began to carefully examine the area and the body itself. However, there was nothing that could help identify the female victim. It was not possible to find a handbag that might have contained documents, a mobile phone, or bank cards. The body was taken for an autopsy, and the police continued to investigate the area around the canal for any clues about the passport-locating identity of the victim. While the medical examiner was working in his office, detectives checked the databases of missing persons to find anything that could help identify the body. In this area, no recent disappearances had been recorded. When it became obvious that the unidentified victim could not be recognized, forensic scientists began searching the canal bank for clues indicating the identity of the deceased or the perpetrator. In the relatively small area where the body was found, cigarette butts and anything that could contain human DNA were collected. To ensure that nothing was missed, a team of divers was called in to check the bottom of the canal. This decision turned out to be correct. One diver managed to retrieve a car jack from the bottom, found just a meter away from the body. The jack, belonging to a standard set for a wing car, had a serial number indicating it was used in a vehicle produced in 1997. It had been in the water for quite a long time, so traces from its surface could have washed away. However, during the examination, human bloodstains were found. They continued to collect data. Initially, it was believed that the victim had been strangled, as characteristic marks remained on her neck. However, the forensic expert concluded that the cause of death was multiple strong blows to the head with a blunt object. The location and shape of the marks resembled those made by a car jack. There were suggestions that the girl could have died in a road accident, but the longer they attempted to prove this, the less plausible the theory seemed. It was soon decided to abandon this idea. It clearly indicated a methodical beating, after which the body was simply thrown into the water. A toxicological examination showed that the victim was either intoxicated from alcohol or under the influence of prohibited substances. The deceased was fully dressed, and no signs of abuse were found. At the same time, there were no marks on her hands that would indicate she had fought for her life. The attack had likely come as a surprise to her, and she was unable to defend herself. According to the forensic expert, she died around 5 a.m. The police had only one clue that could help solve the mystery of her identity: a small stamp on her palm that had miraculously not washed away in the water. Such stamps are given to club visitors at the entrance, allowing security to recognize them without the need to check passes or flyers. Typically, these stamps are unique to each establishment and are not replicated. It was quickly discovered that the victim had visited the Buccaneer Club, located nearby. Shortly before her death, detectives arrived at the club and immediately spoke with the administration and employees, providing them with a description of the deceased. 2 young men recognized the girl because she occasionally attended the disco, but no one knew her name. The detectives managed to access the recordings from the CCTV cameras. Thanks to that, the victim was identified. She had arrived at the club the day before she was found in the canal, apparently leaving Buccaneer around 3 a.m. and being killed by 5 a.m. What happened to her between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. remained unknown. The police spoke to regular patrons and staff in the hope that someone recognized her from the CCTV footage, but no valuable clues about her identity emerged. So far, no missing persons reports had been filed. The police were left with only one option to identify the deceased: to hold a press conference and appeal to the public through the media. Detectives provided a detailed description of the victim and showed footage from the club's CCTV cameras. Within a few hours, a woman admitted that she was the mother of 18-year-old Ilara Vance. She reported that her daughter had gone to the club about a day before these events and had not returned or been in touch. She immediately became concerned. Relatives and friends had no idea where Ilara might have spent the night. No one had seen Ilara after visiting the club, which caused anxiety and prompted her mother to search for her. Approximately 36 hours had passed when she managed to contact the local police station in La, but received the standard excuse that law enforcement officers did not want to waste time looking for a girl who had simply gone on a spree after the club and was likely spending time with friends or a boyfriend. When she saw a news program about the police announcing the discovery of a body and the terrible circumstances surrounding the tragedy, she initially tried to dismiss any bad thoughts about it possibly being her daughter. However, the worry persisted. She literally felt that something bad had happened to her daughter and feared that it was Ilaura's body that had been found in the canal. She acted extremely worried and was very agitated, providing somewhat confused information due to her emotional state. Therefore, the police decided to verify the information with Ilaura's cousin, who had been with Ilara that evening. The young man confirmed some of the details provided by Ilaura's mother. He helped to clarify valuable information, such as the clothing and piercing locations that Ilara had. The victim's identity was almost completely matched. Ilara's mother was notified of the coincidence and was invited to identify the body. All doubts were finally dispelled. The mother was shocked by her daughter's tragic death, and she immediately began to cry. She struggled to understand who could have done this, as her daughter was an ordinary girl who did not associate with problematic people. According to her cousin, they had planned to go to Buccaneer Club together, the seal of which was found on her hand. He described his relationship with Ilara as very friendly and warm. They communicated well and supported each other. That evening, everyone was in good spirits from the very beginning. Ilara's mother had been worried about her daughter attending the party. She felt strongly that Ilara should not go. To calm her mother, Ilara explained that they would not be walking home alone, and that everything would be fine. Despite the fact that her cousin took her to the club, he did not intend to stay there long. Ilara managed to reassure her mother by telling her that her ex-boyfriend, 19-year-old Ethan Thorne, was supposed to drive her home. The whole family knew him well and trusted him. Ethan and Ilara had been in a relationship for about a year, which had ended a couple of months before Ilara's death. As Ilara's mother noted, even after the breakup, they continued to communicate as friends. Law enforcement officers decided to check the records of telephone conversations, which verified that Ilara had indeed called her ex-boyfriend when she left the club. However, the police did not have time to visit his home, as he came to the station on his own initiative to talk to the investigators. Ethan was eager to help because he was worried about what had happened. In his statement, he emphasized that Ilara had contacted him after he left the cinema. He promptly went to the club, where he picked her up in his car in the parking lot. They spent some time together at his house, but at about 4:30 in the morning, Ilara headed home. Ethan believed that she could have been attacked during this time. The police immediately questioned why he did not drive Ilara home at such a late hour. He explained that it was only a short walk left to get home, as the houses were located close together. It was already getting light. He was very tired and drunk, so he could not take her home. Ilara herself did not want to impose on anyone and was not afraid for her safety. Unfortunately, Ethan simply went to bed and turned off his mobile phone to avoid being disturbed until he woke up. He could not reach Ilara, but did not think much of it, believing that she could be spending time with someone new, as there was no romantic relationship between them anymore. However, upon learning about the tragedy in the Vance family, Ethan felt compelled to help with the investigation, so he provided his testimony. The detectives, however, immediately suspected that he might not just want to help. Such behavior is often seen in murderers attempting to divert suspicion from themselves. Thus, they decided not to let him leave too quickly, hoping he would either incriminate himself or provide genuine assistance in the investigation. Suspicion grew stronger as Ethan reacted very calmly to the details of the crime. He did not show any emotions when looking at the disfigured image, and he appeared neither upset nor shocked. His lack of reaction to the details of his ex-girlfriend's death, combined with the fact that he was the last person to see her, made him a person of interest to the detectives. It is known that in such cases, exes are often involved who kill out of jealousy, resentment, or revenge. To establish or refute this, the investigators asked Ethan to show them his car. The detective specifically did not mention the jack that had been found in the canal. He agreed to this request without hesitation, according to his confession. He arrived at the police station in the same car in which he had driven Ilara from the club to his home. The policeman went out into the street with him, and in the parking lot, they found a notch indicating the year of manufacture of the car matched the jack. As soon as the door was opened, they felt a very strong smell of cleaning products. The interior was excessively clean for a young guy. It seemed that a very thorough cleaning had been carried out recently. Nevertheless, Ethan immediately justified himself by saying that he had bought a new car only 10 days prior, and the previous owner had cleaned it well before selling it. The police were most interested in the possibility of blood being present. Perhaps Ethan could have attacked Ilara in his car, or transported the body after the attack. When the mat in the trunk was lifted, they found several suspicious dark red drops that were collected for further analysis. However, none of these stains belonged to Ilara. Nevertheless, Ethan continued to be considered the main suspect. It was believed that this was an attack based on passion, so the killer must have known the victim well. Furthermore, the make of the car matched the jack, and the jack was found at the bottom of the canal. Ethan seemed ideal as a suspect based on all the criteria after they found one valuable clue, a bloodstain on one of Ethan's sneakers. After examination, it was possible to prove that the blood belonged to Ilara, but it was not possible to date it with precision. Ethan insisted that the stain appeared by chance when Ilara had a nosebleed about a month before the tragedy. However, his words could not be confirmed or refuted, so this evidence turned out to be indirect. Even Ilara's family was sure that Ethan could not have done this. He had always been a very nice guy. Ilara's mother believed wholeheartedly that he was not capable of murder. She commented that Ilara was almost crazy about Ethan, based on his appearance. He was very kind, loving, and gave Ilara many gifts. However, their relationship was not entirely smooth. They often argued. Ethan, as an accomplished young man for his age, grew up in a strict but loving family in LA, France. From an early age, he was interested in sports, especially football, which he played with his father. He was not prone to violence and avoided fights, despite being in perfect shape. However, he was forced to drop out of school because of football, wanting to build a sports career, and simply chose training over textbooks. His parents supported their son's decision, especially since he was mature enough for his age. At the same time, they described him as charming, but very jealous. They mentioned that he could become upset over a random photo of a stranger on the internet that Ilara was looking at. As their relationship progressed, Ethan became more and more jealous. Due to such tumultuous dynamics, they eventually broke up. Despite the tensions, they continued to maintain friendly relations, and everything seemed normal. except for the circumstantial evidence against Ethan. There was no concrete proof. He was released pending further investigation. Then Ethan was arrested and charged with Ellara's murder. He spent about a year in prison, but his lawyer managed to get him released before his trial. Ethan repeatedly appealed, claiming there was insufficient evidence to convict him, and was released on bail. However, this lasted until 2011, when his formal trial began. A rather controversial trial lay ahead. From the very beginning, the situation was tense, partly because Ellara's family had changed their opinion about Ethan over the lengthy investigation period. They became convinced, based on several dubious facts, that the deceased's ex-boyfriend was indeed a criminal. Ilara's family now demanded punishment for the supposed killer. At this stage, it was necessary to assess the mental health of the suspect. In June 2008, Ethan was visited by an expert psychiatrist who noted no deviations. Ethan willingly made contact and described in detail the events related to Elara. He admitted that there had indeed been several conflicts, which ended in slaps to the face. Although he did not think this was normal, he justified himself citing jealousy regarding Elara and claiming that she had stolen from him multiple times. After the examination, the specialist concluded that Ethan was completely in his right mind and capable of appearing in court. Tension was literally in the air. The defense team escalated the situation to the point where a fight broke out right in the courtroom. Several people were slightly injured, so the trial was postponed because of this unpleasant incident and the subsequent bureaucratic red tape. Everything was delayed for another year, until 2012, from February 2009 until the start of the trial. In June 2012, Ethan lived with his paternal aunts near Paris. She immediately noticed how angry he was. At first, they thought it was connected to the slander against him. However, his discontent grew as the trial approached. Meanwhile, the Vance family accused Ethan's lawyer of unnecessarily dragging out the proceedings, which only heightened tensions. The first witnesses began to speak at the meetings. There was a mutual friend of Elara and Ethan who recalled that all three of them had once been driving in a car together after their romantic relationship had ended. Ethan had even started dating a new girl who happened to be one of Elara's close friends. This situation made her very upset and jealous. Despite their breakup, a conflict ensued between them, which even escalated to physical confrontation. They exchanged blows. At one point, Elara even attempted to jump out of the moving car, but Ethan managed to pull her back inside. By the time the car reached her friend's house, Elara finally exited and continued yelling at Ethan from the street. He tried to calm her down, but she simply waved her hand dismissively and left the scene. This friend was convinced this was not an isolated incident, as outbursts of jealousy and aggression were repeated throughout their relationship. In addition to this event, Elara's parents recalled several instances during family vacations with Ethan where he lost control. They once caught him walking around the apartment with a weapon. However, he had managed to convince Elara's relatives that it was just a failed joke. They now understood the situation was much more serious. From the very beginning, Elara had been in great danger. Another friend of Ethan recounted an incident where, in a fit of rage, he began to choke one of his girlfriends. The once pleasant, sociable, and good-natured Ethan was now portrayed as a monster capable of losing control at any moment. So, the change in the Vance family's attitude toward him did not seem strange. Ethan had lied about the time. He told the police that Elara left his house at 4:30 a.m. Detectives managed to track their mobile phones and prove that they were still together at 5 a.m., which is when Elara was believed to have died. Subsequently, Elara's phone unexpectedly turned off at 5:10 a.m. previously, during an interrogation. Ethan said that he attempted to contact Elara again but could not get a response. Detectives believed the call to his ex-girlfriend was made intentionally to create an alibi. Shortly thereafter, Ethan's phone also turned off for several hours. Investigators suspected he deliberately turned off his devices to avoid being tracked. Despite all the circumstantial evidence against him, Ethan continued to insist on his innocence. His lawyer argued that none of this evidence proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the investigation, detectives tried to extract a confession from Ethan, but he steadfastly maintained his innocence. The pressure from authorities led him to feel embittered. He claimed that the persecution caused him to face difficulties in real life and to suffer from insults and unfounded accusations. Phone records revealed something intriguing. Ethan's new girlfriend also tried to contact Alara shortly before the murder. At first, she did not disclose any details as to why she tried to contact Alara at all. However, in 2011, the girl spoke to detectives and made a rather dubious statement. According to her, she felt guilty that Alara was dead. The reason for her fears stemmed from the fact that, as a close friend of Alara, she was dating Ethan. This clearly caused great discontent for his ex-girlfriend, who took every opportunity to contact him. On that fateful night, Ethan's new girlfriend decided to act on her feelings. She did not like Alara's attention directed at the guy. She believed that this was the impetus for another conflict between the exes, which ended tragically. When the police received this statement, they were puzzled and decided to explore these new details. The application ended up at the station, and detectives tried to find out if it was possible that she was an accomplice. They insisted that Ethan's new girlfriend may have unintentionally provoked the attack, but did not pursue such a goal intentionally. According to her, she had been afraid to admit it because she feared her boyfriend's reaction. The neck of the deceased showed clear signs of strangulation, as if her throat had been squeezed with bare hands. Apparently, the victim could not have been killed in this way, so the criminal used a metal jack from the car. Although it was inconvenient, it quickly became the instrument that ended the innocent girl's life. The killer inflicted a large number of blows to her head and face, which proved fatal. The degree of cruelty was astounding. He broke her facial bones. The prosecutor addressed the jury, stating that leaving such a dangerous person at large was a crime. Despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the prosecution managed to prove the defendant's guilt. The prosecution's witnesses appeared, scared as they recounted their experiences with the real Ethan. The jury found Ethan Thorne guilty of premeditated murder. As he left the courtroom, he turned to the victim's family and said something that sounded like a threat. From the very moment Ethan found himself behind bars, he began writing endless appeals to challenge the sentence, insisting that he was a victim of bias and incompetence. Probably feeling his helplessness and unbearable situation, he even insulted one of the judges in writing, subsequently refusing to retract his comments, insisting he was a victim of governmental arbitrariness. However, all his requests were rejected. While in prison, he was involved in another incident related to his inability to control his aggression. Using a homemade sharpener, he threatened to kill one of the prison guards, whom he took hostage. For several minutes, Ethan was eventually overpowered and neutralized. Now he remains behind bars. Moving on to another case, the case of Lena Hayes. Sometimes, from the very beginning of an investigation, everything seems to work out. The Supreme Court might directly point to a criminal, but practice shows that they are not always correct. While they tried to connect one person to the crime, the real culprit was walking free. Lena lived in Manhattan, New York, USA. She was a young woman who worked part-time at the post office. She always focused more on family and children than on career success. However, she wanted to get an education. Therefore, after graduating from high school, she entered college and successfully graduated. During this period, she met David Hayes. They began a relationship and then got married. Lena and David lived together for more than 6 years. They raised a child together. From the outside, it seemed that everything was fine in their family, until one day that destroyed the entire family idyll. On June 7th, 2000, Lena was in a good mood as she went to work in the morning, delivering mail around the area. At about 3:30 p.m., she returned home and, as always, found no one there yet. Lena arrived first and was getting ready for her husband to return from work. She had a 5-year-old son who was visiting his grandparents at that time. The boy was supposed to return in the evening. Once inside, Lena immediately noticed a strange mess on the kitchen table and found a suspicious note. She remembered that no one was there when she left for work. No one from the household could have come and left a message. Her husband was at work and never showed up during the day. Lena didn't have time to figure it all out, began to read the note, which turned out to have quite disturbing content. While she scanned the piece of paper, a stranger came out of a dark room and headed towards her, weapon at the ready. Without warning, he attacked her twice. The first bullet missed, but the second hit Lena in the lower abdomen. She fell to the floor and screamed in pain, losing consciousness. When she came to her senses, the attacker was nowhere to be seen. Lena barely reached the phone and tried to call her husband for help, but the phone was not working. She wanted to get to her mobile phone but could not remember where she left it. Fearing that the stranger might still be nearby, Lena crawled to the front door and carefully opened it. She stood up, leaning against the wall, and left the house. Lena tried to attract the attention of others to scare off the criminal. She was bleeding and managed to walk only a couple of meters before she fell down, exhausted. She knew her husband would be finishing work soon and would be near the house. That is exactly what happened. A few minutes later, he drove up in his car and immediately noticed his wife lying on the ground near the house. Lena was covered in blood, but still alive. David picked her up and placed her in the back seat of the car. Lena was weak, but tried to tell him about the attack. She pointed to the courtyard, but her husband still didn't understand what she wanted. There was no time to figure it out. David realized his wife's condition could be critical. Driving towards the hospital, David dialed 911, informed them that he had found his wife wounded near their house, and was heading to the hospital. He asked them to meet them on the way. Lena was still conscious, said that a man had attacked her. She mentioned the name like Barry several times, claiming he had set up an ambush. By the time Lena arrived at the hospital, she had already lost consciousness. Doctors urgently took her to the operating room, but she died right on the table before receiving help. Her twin sister, Sarah Miller, arrived at the medical center a few minutes later. David informed her about the attack. She hurried because she wanted to support her sister. However, she didn't have enough time. When Sarah received the tragic news of her sister's death, she approached David and accused him of what had happened. David seemed embarrassed. Sarah vowed to bring him to justice. The police immediately spoke to David, who became the main suspect because typically the closest people are involved in such cases. From the very beginning, David referenced Lena's own words about the shooting and the ambush organized by a certain Barry. The problem was that he did not know a single person among her acquaintances by that name. Sarah also could not recall anyone by that name. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined the crime scene and managed to find a considerable amount of evidence confirming that someone had indeed set up an ambush there and spent a significant amount of time in the house waiting for the victim. Such persistence seemed to indicate hatred, anger, and a personal motive. This only confirmed to the detectives that the criminal should be sought among the victim's immediate surroundings. Nothing was stolen from the house, so the robbery theory was immediately excluded. Mysterious Barry had taken a shower, played video games, and even found an adult toy belonging to Lena. It is not known what he did with it, or why he left it in a prominent place in the bedroom. It became clear why Lena could not call from home. For help, it was impossible, because the killer had cut the phone line. He clearly wanted to deprive the victim of any chance to survive, and it worked. Doctors were sure that with timely assistance, she could have been saved. Despite the fact that the shot did not kill her immediately and she was able to leave the house, there was no one to help her. Unfortunately, she had to wait for David to arrive for some time, during which she lost a lot of blood. The detectives discovered traces of David, her husband. He continued to insist that he had nothing to do with the ambush. There were cigarette butts lying everywhere in the house, suggesting that the killer had smoked more than a pack of cigarettes while waiting. For Lena, during the investigation, it turned out that neither the victim herself nor her husband smoked that brand of cigarettes. Although this was not strong evidence of his innocence, this became the first piece of evidence in favor of David's alibi. It was strange that the criminal had entered the house without breaking in. David believed that all the windows and doors should have been closed before he left for work, but the shooter could have escaped through the window, which was wide open. During the searches, David remembered that his wife sometimes left the kitchen window slightly open to air out the house. This change in testimony was perceived as a very alarming sign. Spent cartridges were found at the scene of the crime. The first bullet hit a wooden wall. Flax was collected for further examination, and the police tried their best to find the weapon, but it was all in vain. Now, locating it had become a priority. It was believed that David managed to dispose of the gun, and naturally, he did not confess to this. Everything seemed to be against David. He was the first to report the incident, and had spent the last minutes of Lena's life with her. His entire car was covered in blood, as were his hands and clothes. When David's office was searched, even more suspicious evidence was found. A special device for recording calls was installed on the family's home phone. Thanks to it, David could listen to their conversations while at work, checking his suspicions. This immediately drew the attention of the authorities to David. This became a reason to increase pressure on him. The most curious piece of evidence was a note found at the scene, which appeared to be a suicide note, but not written by Lena or her husband. A new name also surfaced in this case, Marcus. On the other hand, David and Lena had serious problems, which offered more reasons to commit a crime. The recordings of telephone conversations were linked to his attempts to catch his wife in infidelity. He planned to use all of this to gain an advantage in court during their pending divorce. As it turned out, both were unfaithful in their marriage. David had already had 2 mistresses, which Lena knew about. These affairs significantly contributed to the collapse of their marriage. At the time of the attack, Lena also had a lover. They contacted him, but the man's name was not Marcus, and he did not appear to look like a killer. From the beginning, all suspicions were removed when he provided a reliable alibi. Just 2 days before her death, Lena had called and complained about problems in the marriage, mentioning that they were even sleeping in different rooms. That for over a month, nothing had kept them together, except for their 5-year-old son, Jacob. Lena had long wanted to file for divorce, but saw how well her child was with his father, and did not want to ruin that bond. David truly played a significant role in Jacob's life. However, this no longer mattered against the backdrop of constant quarrels. Lena could no longer tolerate the conflicts and was planning to file for divorce. It is obvious that this gave David more reasons for anger. He could have been jealous of her, fearing that he would lose his son or be forced to share custody or pay alimony. Sarah confirmed that they indeed had disputes about their child and both wanted to obtain custody rights, making the divorce process expectedly difficult. Sarah, too, had reason to confront David with accusations right in the medical center. However, The most compelling and disturbing arguments for the investigation came from Lena's friends. Everyone knew that Lena had serious marital problems, but the situation was worse than it seemed. Lena had repeatedly stated that if something happened to her, David would definitely be guilty. The possibility of financial motives for the crime also emerged. As their relationship began to crumble, David could solve all his problems at once and gain some benefit. This turned out to be true, because a life insurance policy for Lena was found during the investigation, with her husband and son as the beneficiaries. Of course, David denied everything. He was interrogated for hours, but he insisted that under no circumstances would he kill the mother of his child. He claimed that he loved his son too much to deprive him of the most valuable person in his son's life. According to the investigation, there was not enough evidence to bring charges. More material evidence was needed. At a minimum, it was necessary to wait for the results of all the examinations. Contrary to the detective's expectations, doubts about the correctness of the choice of the main suspect arose with the first reports. The note found in the courtyard of the Hayes house, identified as a suicide note, was signed by a certain Marcus. However, the handwriting was not very legible, and the note itself was slightly contaminated with the blood of Lena, complicating matters. It was clear that the note was addressed to a woman named Sophia, and the letter was addressed to my wife, Sophia. At first, this confusion deepened because Sophia Hayes did not exist. But there were other details in the letter, including an address that matched with Sophia Thorne. This young woman lived at the location indicated in the note. She had a daughter and a husband named Marcus Thorne. The Thorne family home was located approximately 5 kilometers from the ambush site where Lena was found. When the police checked Marcus Thorne in their database, it turned out that he fit the profile of the killer, as he had previously encountered problems with the law. Until recently, Marcus had committed only minor offenses, but he was now under investigation for something far more serious. Shortly before Lena's death, he had abused his 3-month-old daughter. Initially, detectives believed that this note could have been written by David to mislead them and remove suspicion from himself. However, this clue needed proper analysis. In the suicide letter, Marcus indicated that he wanted to leave this life voluntarily because he could not imagine being imprisoned for abusing a child. This all appeared suspicious. When the detectives arrived at his house, where they found only his wife, Sophia, she admitted that he had not lived there since her statement about the child abuse case. Sophia was very angry with Marcus. When she found out what happened to the Hayes family, she was shocked because, in her opinion, Marcus did not look like a killer. Although she was no longer sure of anything, she was amazed at how close she had led a true madman capable of such atrocities into her life. She told the police where Marcus could be, and the detectives arrived at the specified address. But even there, the suspect could not be found. Investigators contacted his close friends, but they also did not know where he could be. In the media, an alert was issued that a dangerous criminal was on the run, and they believed he could not have gone far. Additionally, considering the suicide note, they expected to find his lifeless body sooner. Tracking him down, the police used K9 units with specially trained dogs and aerial support from police helicopters. The search took nearly a day, until finally the dogs led the police to the basement of a house. There, Marcus was found lying on the floor, shirtless, with 6 nicotine patches stuck to his chest. He was alive. The man told the police that he had attempted to take his own life by overdosing on nicotine. This was probably meant to convince everyone that he felt remorseful. Marcus did not resist when he was arrested. He even seemed a little glad that it was all finally over. At the time of the crime, Marcus Thorne was 26 years old. His behavior raised doubts about his mental stability. Some suspected he might have mental issues. However, a psychiatric examination indicated that He was aware of his actions both during and after the crime. This led investigators to suspect that he was merely trying to elicit sympathy with his threats. Sophia provided detectives with writing samples that were analyzed by a handwriting expert. The expert found several significant characteristics that distinguished Marcus's handwriting. He noted the similarity in the spelling of the lowercase g and f in the suicide note and in the samples. According to the analysis, there was almost a 100% probability that this letter was written by Marcus himself. After this conclusion, the case against David began to collapse. Prior to Marcus's arrest, the police had offered David a polygraph test. He agreed and passed with flying colors, which should have strengthened their confidence in his innocence, but they did not want to let him go. David was kept under suspicion until Marcus confessed to attacking Lena, making it clear that David had no involvement in the crime. David was subsequently released. Another key piece of evidence was the DNA found on the toy in the house. The expert used dozens of filters to collect particles of saliva and skin from the killer, which also matched Marcus's profile. This linked him to the crime scene. The day before Marcus was arrested, the police found a 9mm handgun, a significant discovery. Despite a thorough search, they did not find this 9mm handgun registered to David. The gun was later confiscated and examined, but ballistics tests showed that it was not the weapon used to kill Lena. However, a dog team found another gun of the appropriate caliber in the woods near the house. Ballistics experts were now able to compare the bullets, cartridges, and guns. Tests were conducted. The markings on the bullets were then compared to objects from the scene of the massacre. The tests allowed investigators to prove that Lena was shot with this pistol. Fingerprints were found on the handle of the pistol, which also led to the arrest of a child abuser, Marcus. During the search of Marcus's house, police managed to find 9mm Cobra cartridges for a concealed carry pistol on the body under his clothing, as well as other evidence. All this confirmed that Marcus was the weapon's owner. Sophia also told the police that he always carried a weapon with him, which he bought for self-defense. However, this had little effect on the situation with David. Even after that, he still looked suspicious. There were too many doubts against him because of the existing motive. Therefore, his status changed. It was now believed that he did not kill his wife with his own hands, but became the mastermind behind the murder, using Marcus as the executive. However, he refused to admit he didn't even know Marcus. The theory that David hired Marcus to kill his wife was also carefully investigated for a long time. The correspondence and calls were analyzed, but no connection leading Lena to Marcus could be found. It seemed they were not acquainted at all. Against this backdrop, authorities tried to find at least some connection between the criminal and his victim in order to understand the motive for the attack. For a long time, it was thought this would help uncover David's involvement in the crime. It seemed suspicious that Lena called out a similar name before her death. Perhaps she really knew him or was trying to say something else, but her husband did not hear. The closest tie the police found was the period when Marcus worked as a security guard at the library where Lena occasionally borrowed books. They both had membership cards for the institution and exchanged pleasantries with each other. However, when questioned, the employees of the library could not remember any incidents involving Marcus. The staff described Marcus as a somewhat strange young man. While he worked as a security guard, he had no problems in his service record. At least none were known at his workplace. In fact, during this period, Marcus had only minor offenses. When they questioned him about his job at the library, he could not recall anything that might connect him to Lena. Eventually, the detectives were forced to admit that this murder was a spontaneous act of aggression against an unknown person and a coincidence with David. All suspicions against David were dismissed. Marcus Thorne was not familiar with Lena Hayes. The choice of victim was random. He was merely driving around the city on his moped, looking for a suitable house to ambush. The Hayes house seemed ideal to him primarily because he spotted an open window that allowed for easy entry. Once inside the house, Marcus clearly envisioned his actions. He had no specific target and was prepared to shoot whomever entered first, aiming to harm an innocent person. He smoked to ease his nerves. When it became clear he'd have to wait, he played video games and rummaged through the rooms. He never commented on Lena's abandoned adult toy. When Marcus discovered that Lena had a husband and a 5-year-old son at the time, he claimed he would have shot any of them without discrimination or hesitation, even a child, if they had entered the house. Marcus also confessed to abusing a 3-month child. Due to the ongoing investigation, he later told the authorities that he did not want to go to jail for child abuse, especially considering the familial ties and age of the victim. He was aware of how badly prisoners with such convictions were treated and described in detail the suffering caused by his fear of incarceration. Therefore, he sought a way to remedy the situation. Marcus decided to go to jail as a murderer. He likely did not realize that he would be tried for both crimes and face 2 sentences, making it impossible to entirely hide his dark past. While in the ambush house, Marcus altered his plan and decided to take his own life after committing the murder, so he didn't particularly care about leaving evidence. With these thoughts, he even wrote a suicide note. He spent several days behind bars and eventually told the police, without waiting for his lawyer, that he wanted to officially plead guilty to Lena's murder. Marcus was not planning to deny his guilt regarding the abuse of a 3-month-old. His conscience was eating away at him, and he was ready to talk to detectives again. The entire local community was shocked by what had happened, especially Sophia, who had already suffered greatly. The media eagerly reported that a 3-month-old baby had been abused by her own father. Authorities feared public unrest and felt compelled to provide increased protection for the criminal. When Sophia learned that her husband was willing to kill any person, even a child, to avoid jail time for his shameful crime, she desperately wanted him imprisoned forever, or better yet, sentenced to death, so that this bloody chaos would end as soon as possible. Given the evidence collected, even without a confession, Marcus Thorne faced little chance of receiving a lenient sentence. He was found guilty of murdering Lena Hayes and abusing a baby, receiving the highest punishment, before being placed on death row. The court's decision elicited strong reactions from both the killer's wife and the family of the deceased, who finally breathed a sigh of relief and continued to raise their children. Marcus's lawyer fought for a temporary reprieve, even managing to secure one at first, and subsequently signed a written agreement with the authorities, stating that he would never again appeal the sentence if the death penalty were commuted to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. This agreement worked. Marcus Thorne is now serving a life sentence and remains behind bars. Story 3. He pushed his son down a cliff. But before that moment, Jerome found something that would change everything. A diary hidden in his son Aiden's room on July 21st, 2022. Inside were names, dates, and chilling details. Aiden wasn't just venting. He had a plan, a list of people he wanted to hurt, methods, places, revenge. The journal didn't just reveal secrets. It revealed something far darker, and Jerome had no idea how far his son had gone, or what it would cost him to find out. Jerome, the father, stands frozen, his body tense. His mind is weighed down by a secret so heavy he can barely carry it. This secret has led him to this moment, standing on the edge of something he can't take back. He watches his son, the boy he once held in his arms, the child he promised to protect. But now, as he stands on the edge of this cliff, his love for Aiden feels distant, tangled with fear. A father's love or a father's curse, a son's fate or a father's nightmare. These words echo in his mind, too loud to ignore, as though they weren't meant to be answered, just to haunt him. The wind picks up, making the trees rustle louder, breaking the silence around them. Jerome's hesitation grows. He steps forward slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. His feet feel heavy, like the earth itself is trying to hold him back. The choice hangs in the air like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts. He looks at Aidan, his mind flashing back to the days when his son laughed in his arms, innocent and full of joy. Those days feel so far away now, like they belong to another person. But now, as Jerome steps closer to Aidan, something inside him stops him. He pauses, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. He sees Aidan so young, so vulnerable, and it freezes him. The fight inside him is too much to bear. Is this really the moment when a father's love turns into something dark? When protection turns into harm? Can he really do this? Aidan turns around, sensing something in the air. Their eyes meet, and in that moment, Jerome sees the confusion in his son's eyes. Aidan doesn't understand what's happening. He doesn't know the battle his father is facing, but Jerome knows. He knows that. This is the moment that will change everything. This is the moment when a father has to choose. Will he protect his son or destroy him? But Jerome hesitates. The hand that was once steady now shakes. His feet refuse to move. In that quiet moment, the weight of what he's about to do presses down on him. He sees Aidan, the boy he raised, the boy he loves, and for just a moment, everything slows down. This decision is no longer about saving his family. It's about this one moment, standing there with his son, looking at the child he promised to protect. Jerome Carter, a man in his late 40s, was the kind of man you'd pass on the street and never give a second thought. Quiet, reserved, with a gentle demeanor that made him seem like just another husband, just another father. He had a wife, Tiffany, who loved him dearly, a woman whose warmth and support balanced his more distant nature. On the surface, their life seemed normal, a small house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of life most people would envy. But beneath the surface, something was breaking, something neither of them fully understood. Jerome had always been the provider, the protector. It was in his nature. He was the kind of man who held his family together, even when things weren't easy. But over time, something had changed. The protective instincts that once defined him now felt suffocating. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man overwhelmed by fear. Fear that his own son, the child he loved more than anything, might be dangerous. The thought gnawed at him every day. Was his son a threat? Was he the one who needed protecting? Aidan, Jerome's 14-year-old son, had always been an enigma. He was quiet, withdrawn, and different from the other kids. While most children his age were carefree and full of energy, Aidan spent long hours alone, either staring at a computer screen or lost in his own thoughts. He never spoke much about what was going on in his head, and his parents could never quite place the intensity in his eyes. There was something about him that felt off, something that didn't fit with the normal image of a teenager. And the bullying. It started small, but grew over time. At first it was just whispers in the hallways, then snickers behind his back. There were moments, flashes of his childhood, when it seemed like everything could be different. A family vacation, a day in the park, Jerome and Aidan side by side, laughing together, a time when the bond between father and son felt unbreakable. Back then, everything felt simple, pure, but those days seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a son who no longer laughed, no longer trusted, and a father who couldn't understand why. On the 21st of July, 2022, one day as Jerome was searching for his son's laptop charger, he found it, hidden beneath a pile of old video games, a red leather-bound journal. He had no reason to suspect anything, no reason to think that this small book could shatter everything he knew about his son. But when Jerome opened the pages, his heart sank. As he flipped through the journal, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It wasn't just the scribbled thoughts of a teenager. It was a list of names. His son had been keeping track of his classmates, and it wasn't just names. There were detailed descriptions, methods, dates, tools. Each page held a chilling vision of violence, a fantasy of revenge. The people who had tormented Aiden were all listed there, each one marked with a plan. Jerome's hands shook as he read through the pages. At first, it was disbelief. Then came the realization. His son wasn't just angry. He wasn't just upset. No. Aiden had been fantasizing about something far worse, something that filled Jerome with a deep, paralyzing fear. This wasn't just a phase. This was something darker. And it was clear now the boy he had tried to protect had become someone else. Entirely. Jerome sat in the dim light of their living room, the red leather-bound journal lying heavy in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Tiffany to read it. She was sitting across from him, eyes wide with disbelief as she flipped through the pages, her face growing paler with each new revelation. Every word in that journal seemed to pull the air from the room, suffocating them both. Tiffany's voice trembled as she asked, "How could he? How could Aiden write this?" The shock on her face mirrored Jerome's own. They didn't understand. They couldn't comprehend how their innocent son, the child they'd raised with so much love, could have written such horrific things. This wasn't some teenage rebellion or acting out. This was something darker, something much more disturbing. Jerome's thoughts were clouded with fear. "He's not just angry, Tiffany," he said, his voice shaking with intensity. This is a plan, a kill list." His words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. He stared at the pages, his mind racing. Aiden is a threat. He's a psychopathic monster in the making. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, Jerome. He's not a monster. He's just a kid who's been hurt. We've failed him. But he doesn't need to be punished. He needs help. He needs therapy. He needs love." She reached out for his hand, but Jerome pulled away, unable to accept her comforting words. Jerome's eyes were hard as he looked at her. Love isn't going to fix this. He's already planning to kill people. He's already written out how it will happen. Do you want to wait until he actually does it? The tension between them was unbearable. Tiffany couldn't grasp the idea that her son, her baby boy, could be a danger to anyone. But Jerome couldn't see it any other way. He felt trapped, in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. In his mind, Aiden wasn't the victim. He was the ticking time bomb. And if Jerome didn't act, it could all come crashing down. The weight of his decision pressed down on him with every passing moment. The idea of protecting his family from his own flesh and blood tore at him, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. His son was capable of terrible things. The plan had already started. Jerome spent the night thinking, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. He paced back and forth, each step a march toward the inevitable. He knew what he had to do. He had already planned it, already set it in motion. The father-son hike was not what it seemed. Jerome wasn't taking Aiden to the mountains to reconnect. No, this was a one-way trip, a trip where there would be no return for Aiden. His plan was to push Aiden down when they got to the steepest part of the ridge. Jerome's mind swirled with thoughts of what was to come, but as he thought about the hike, memories of better days flooded his mind. He remembered Aiden as a child, so full of life. He remembered the laughter, the long days spent playing together. He remembered the way Aiden's small hand used to fit perfectly in his. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, like a dream that was slipping further away with each passing second. The pain was unbearable. The father in him longed to protect his son, to hold him close and tell him everything would be okay. But the fear in him, the fear of what Aidan might become, drove him forward. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man forced to make an unthinkable choice. Jerome and Aidan made their way up the Blue Ridge Mountains, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the rustling of the trees their only company. The sun was high in the sky, the day beautiful in its serenity. It seemed like any other hike, a father and son spending time together in nature. The air was crisp, the landscape vast and untouched. But there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could escape. Jerome tried to maintain a calm exterior, even as his thoughts raced, his every step weighed down by the decision he had already made. Aidan, for his part, walked, his backpack bouncing lightly with each step, the sound of his shoes against the trail creating a rhythm. He didn't notice the look in his father's eyes, the unease that clung to Jerome's every movement. Jerome forced a smile, tried to keep the conversation light, asking Aidan about his school, his friends, anything to distract himself from the growing weight of what he was about to do. The quiet stretch of the path seemed to go on forever, but eventually they reached the steepest part of the trail. The drop on either side of them was sharp, the view breathtaking but terrifying. Jerome's heart pounded as he looked at the cliff ahead. This was the moment. He had planned it all, the right spot, the perfect opportunity. "Go on ahead," Jerome said, his voice more strained than he intended. "I'll catch up." Aidan didn't question it. He simply nodded, his gaze distant as he moved ahead along the trail. Jerome stood there for a moment, his body trembling, every muscle in him screaming to stop. But he took the first step forward, the weight of his decision crushing him with each movement. He could hear the distant sound of Aidan's footsteps, the space between them growing with every second. With every step, Jerome's heart thudded harder, his breath growing more shallow. This was it. His mind played out the scene 100 times. The push, the fall, the end, and then nothing. No more worry, no more fear. His family would be safe. He could protect Tiffany. He could protect them all. But then something inside him stopped. Jerome's feet froze. His body locked in place as his eyes landed on Aidan, ahead. Of him, he could see his son now, walking with a slight bounce in his step, unaware of the storm that had been building in his father's chest. Jerome's breath hitched as memories flooded his mind. The first time he held Aidan in his arms, the baby's tiny hand gripping his finger. He remembered the way Aidan had smiled, the innocent joy in his eyes before the world had tainted him. He thought of the days when Aidan would run to him, his face lighting up with excitement, always seeking his approval, his protection. And now here he was, about to end it all. The weight of that thought nearly crushed him. He was a father, and yet here he was, poised to destroy the very thing he had vowed to protect. The guilt, the pain, the loss, it all hit him in that one frozen moment. His mind screamed to push, to end the nightmare, but his heart screamed louder. Aidan, sensing the shift, turned around. Their eyes met. It wasn't the confrontation Jerome had been expecting. There was no question, no fear, no anger. Instead, Aidan's gaze held confusion, almost a quiet understanding. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why his father had stopped. Instead, he turned away, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Jerome stood there, a cold sweat covering his skin, the world around him suddenly too loud, too real. Aidan didn't need to speak. His actions said it all. The silence between them was deafening, a thick wall that Jerome couldn't break through. Aidan knew. Then, in a flash, Jerome's mind went numb. His instincts took over. His hand shot out, and in one swift motion, he shoved Aiden. The force of the push sent his son stumbling, flailing for balance. Aiden's body lurched forward, and, for a terrifying second, he seemed to struggle against the inevitable pull of gravity. Time seemed to slow as Jerome watched his son topple over the edge. Aiden's eyes widened in shock, his arms reaching out in a desperate attempt to catch himself. But it was too late. One small push. That was all it took. In an instant, Aiden was falling, tumbling down the cliffside, his body disappearing into the abyss below. The next Monday, Jerome and Tiffany sat in their living room, the weight of the previous weekend still hanging heavy in the air. They hadn't spoken much about Aiden since the hike, but every moment felt thick with unspoken words and guilt. Their thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. It was Aiden's school counselor. Jerome answered, and the conversation was brief. The counselor's voice was calm but firm. "I'd like to meet with you both," she said, her tone carrying an urgency that immediately set alarm bells ringing in Jerome's mind. "Has something happened?" Tiffany asked, her voice tight with unease. There was a brief pause before the counselor spoke again. "I need to talk to you both in person. Please come by the school as soon as possible." Jerome hung up the phone, exchanging a look with Tiffany. Neither of them had expected this. They arrived at the school, their nerves frayed, unsure of what to expect. The counselor, a woman in her early 40s, greeted them warmly, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in her eyes. She led them into her office, where she sat them down with a comforting but unyielding look. "I'm afraid what I'm about to tell you is not easy to hear," she began, her voice steady but laden with empathy. "Aiden is a good kid." Jerome's chest tightened. He could feel the blood drain from his face. What could she possibly mean? He'd been so sure, so certain, that Aiden was a threat to everyone around him. The counselor continued, her voice calm but direct. "Your son has been severely bullied for months. I've gathered disturbing footage from the school camera showing the true horror he's endured." Tiffany and Jerome exchanged confused glances, the reality of what was being said sinking in. Slowly, the counselor clicked a button, and the footage began to play on the small screen in front of them. The images were hard to watch. The first clip showed Aiden in a dimly lit locker room. He was being choked by Thomas Parker, his body writhing. As he struggled to breathe, the footage was shaky, but the pain was clear in Aiden's eyes. Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The next clip was just as difficult. Tiffany Myers, one of Aiden's classmates, spitting directly into his face in the school cafeteria. She stood there laughing, as Aiden wiped his face in humiliation. The last clip was the hardest to watch. Malik Dawson, another classmate, dragging Aiden into the school bathroom with cruel laughter. He shoved Aiden's head into the toilet and flushed it, his body trembling in humiliation. Jerome's hands clenched into fists, the guilt gnawing at his insides. The evidence was undeniable. This was the reality Aiden had been living with. The counselor paused the footage and turned to look at them, her expression filled with compassion but also sorrow. These were not just isolated incidents, Jerome. This went on for months, and Aiden never spoke about it. He didn't want to show how much he was hurting. Jerome felt a wave of nausea hit him. The kill list, the journal. Everything he had seen as a threat was now a desperate cry for help. The names on the list were not the victims. They were Aiden's tormentors. Jerome's mind reeled as he processed the truth, the pain he had caused, the decision he had made in a moment of fear. All of it felt unbearable now. Aiden hadn't been plotting murder. He had been fantasizing about revenge. He wanted to feel powerful in a world where he had been crushed under the weight of bullying and neglect. Aiden was a victim, and in their attempt to protect themselves from a fear they had misunderstood, they had destroyed the one person who needed their help the most. Tiffany's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Jerome's hand. "We failed." "Him," she whispered, her voice breaking with sorrow. Jerome could only nod, the weight of their mistake too heavy to bear. The counselor's words echoed in their minds as they left the school. They had thought they were protecting their family. They had thought they were doing the right thing. But in reality, they had allowed their fear to shape their decisions, leading them down a path that could never be undone. As they drove home, the quiet between them was suffocating. They had been given the truth, but the damage was already done. And now there was no turning back. The truth hit harder than anything else Jerome had done, the unthinkable, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had failed his son when Aidan needed him most. He had failed to see the signs, failed to understand the depth of his son's pain. Instead of being a protector, he had been a coward, acting on fear, blinded by his own misconceptions. The silence in their home was suffocating. Jerome could hardly breathe as the realization sank in. His son was gone, and he had a part in it. There was no forgiveness for what he had done. Tiffany was sitting on the edge of their bed, her knees drawn to her chest, holding Aidan's hoodie in her hands. The fabric, once soft and comforting, now felt like an unbearable weight. She had seen the journal. She had read Aidan's words, and like Jerome, she had misunderstood him. She had been blinded by the same fear, the same protective instinct, but the guilt was different for her. She hadn't been the one to physically push him, to almost take his life, but the feeling of loss, of complete failure, consumed her just as much. "We failed him," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Her tears stained the hoodie, and for a moment she allowed herself to grieve for the son they had lost, for the life they had destroyed. But then her voice shifted. The sorrow that had weighed so heavily on her seemed to harden, transforming into something else, something darker. "But we don't have to fail justice," she said, her words firm and resolute. It was as if a switch had flipped in her mind. Jerome looked up at his wife, his eyes bloodshot, the rage bubbling beneath the surface. The pain of losing Aidan, of realizing the depths of his son's suffering, had turned into something much more dangerous. The guilt had twisted into fury, and now it was a fire that consumed him entirely. His son had been wronged, tormented for months, and the people responsible for that torment had to pay. His fists clenched, and he could feel the rage boiling. Inside him, every ounce of that protective instinct now twisted into a violent thirst for revenge. The tormentors, Tiffany, Malik, they had to pay for what they had done. Aidan had been failed by so many, including them, and now it was their turn to feel what it was like to be powerless, to be hurt in a way that could never be undone. Jerome stood up, his body tense, his face twisted with a mixture of grief and fury. He had made up his mind. The decision was clear. They would hunt down those responsible, one by one. They would make them feel the same pain Aidan had felt. This wouldn't be a matter of justice. It would be about retribution. Tiffany didn't flinch. She was right there with him, her resolve just as strong. They had failed their son once, but they wouldn't fail him again. This time, they would make sure the ones who hurt Aidan would pay. With that, the darkness settled over them like a cloak, and they began their deadly journey, determined to make the world pay for what it had done to their child. The pain had already consumed them. The question now was whether their thirst for vengeance would ever be quenched. Their first stop was Thomas Parker, the boy who had choked Aidan in the locker room, the bully who had never once thought about the consequences of his actions. Jerome and Tiffany tracked him through their small town, watching from the shadows as he stepped out of a convenience store. Oblivious to what was coming, they didn't hesitate. They stormed toward him with fury. In their eyes, grabbing him by his collar and dragging him to the ground. Thomas fought back at first, shouting for help, but the strength of Jerome's grip was overwhelming. They beat him until his body went limp, until his voice was nothing more than a faint whimper. They took him to an enclosed area, then they tied him to a fence, just like Aidan had imagined in his journal. They set his shoes on fire, watching with cold satisfaction as the flames consumed them and Thomas's body, the rubber melting away. It was a ritual of revenge, a grim symbol of what Aidan had endured. The smoke rose into the air, and in their twisted sense of justice, it felt like the weight of the years of bullying was finally burning away. The next target was Tiffany Myers, the girl who had spat on Aidan in front of the whole cafeteria, humiliating him in front of his peers. They abducted her from her parents' house and shoved her into the trunk of their car, and drove for hours, the silence between them thick with anger. Hours later, her body was discovered hanging upside down from a tree, drenched in blood. Jerome and Tiffany didn't speak a word as they watched the horror unfold. The world in their eyes was now a place of brutal reckoning. Every action they took was a repayment, an eye for an eye, and there was more to come. Malik Dawson, the last on their list, was the most chilling of all. He had been the one to dunk Aidan's head in the toilet and flush it, laughing with his friends as Aidan's body trembled in humiliation. He had been the one who, along with Thomas and Tiffany, had made Aidan's life a nightmare. But Malik was going to pay the highest price for what he had done. They found him taking a stroll down an alley. Jerome and Tiffany didn't waste time with words. They forced him into a car, taking him to a remote location. There, in the middle of nowhere, they dug his own grave. The ground was hard and unforgiving, just like the pain Aidan had endured. Malik too begged for mercy, but his cries were drowned out by the sound of his own shovel striking the earth. Once the grave was ready, they threw him into it, burying him alive with nothing but Aidan's photo pressed to his chest. It was a final act of vengeance, an unspoken symbol of the suffering Malik had caused. As the dirt was shoveled over him, his muffled cries were silenced, and the weight of his actions, like the weight of the other bullies, was buried forever. For Jerome and Tiffany, there was no remorse, no regret. What they had done, they believed, was justified. Aidan had been the victim, and these were the ones who had tormented him, broken him, and made him suffer. In their eyes, this was the only justice that could be had. The world might see it as murder, but for them, it was payback, a brutal, unforgiving response to the years of torment their son had faced. As they drove away from each of these grim scenes, there was a hollow emptiness that followed them. They had done what they had set out to do, but it didn't bring Aidan back. It didn't undo the past. And no matter how much blood they spilled, the damage was irreversible. Detective Bruce Harris had been on the case from the beginning, watching as the investigation unfolded with a growing sense of unease. He was no stranger to violent crimes. He had dealt with murders and missing persons in his years of service, but something about this case felt different. Something about the brutality and the symbolism of the deaths gnawed at him, as if there was a story being told that was hiding just beneath the surface. He began to dig deeper, silently piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. At first, it was the manner of the killings. Each victim had been humiliated in some way, their deaths fitting into a grotesque pattern. The connections were too clear to ignore, too intentional to be random. Detective Harris started to make a list. All the victims were connected to one person, Aidan Carter. The more he investigated, the more it became apparent that someone was hunting down the bullies who had tormented the boy. It wasn't just revenge, it was a message, a personal vendetta. Harris kept his suspicions to himself, quietly gathering evidence. He knew that if he revealed too much too soon, it could alert the killers. His mind turned back to Jerome and Tiffany. Carter, the parents of Aidan. The more Harris dug, the more the pieces began to fit. There were reports of the parents' involvement in various parts of town around the time each of the killings occurred. Jerome's unusual behavior, Tiffany's sudden silence after Aiden's death at all, pointed to one thing. They were not just grieving parents, they were the orchestrators of these killings. A breakthrough came when Harris found a clue that sent a chill down his spine. A local store surveillance video showing Jerome and Tiffany together buying supplies at the convenience store, same one Thomas was abducted from. It was enough to convince Harris that they were involved, and soon it became clear that the couple had been the ones behind the deaths all along. The investigation took a darker turn as Harris and his team began to track Jerome and Tiffany's movements, but they were always one step ahead. The couple had become masters of evasion, disappearing into the shadows whenever they sensed danger. But their time was running out. Harris had finally connected the dots, and now it was only a matter of time before they would have to answer for the brutal acts they had carried out in the name of revenge. The murders shocked the town, sending ripples of fear and confusion through the community. Initially, the police labeled the deaths as vigilante killings, an act of retaliation for the brutal bullying Aiden had suffered. But the town, small and close-knit, didn't know how to react. Some saw Jerome and Tiffany as heroes, parents who had taken matters into their own hands when the system failed them. These people viewed the deaths as justice, believing that no one else would have acted when Aiden had been let down by both his school and his family. They saw Jerome and Tiffany as the last line of defense, protecting their child in the only way they knew how. But for others, the story was far darker. They saw two cold-blooded killers who had taken the law into their own hands, showing no mercy to the people responsible for their son's torment. The idea of parents committing such brutal acts of violence in the name of revenge shook the town. To its core, the killings didn't feel like justice. They felt like murder. And the fact that Jerome and Tiffany had gone to such extremes made their actions feel even more chilling. In the eyes of many, they were no better than the very bullies who had tormented Aiden in the first place. As the weeks passed, the town became divided. Jerome and Tiffany became infamous. They were now names spoken in hushed tones, whispered about at dinner tables and in the streets. Some people placed flowers outside their home, leaving notes of support. Others spray-painted their house with derogatory messages, calling them monsters. The complex web of emotions and judgments made it impossible to tell whether they were heroes or villains. And all the while, Jerome and Tiffany were on the run. Their names, once familiar and ordinary, were now cursed and celebrated in equal measure. They had no home, no place to hide. The police were closing in, but they knew it was only a matter of time before their past caught up with them. They had become fugitives, moving from place to place, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering if the next knock at the door would be their last. The police investigation was relentless, but it led them down a trail of dead ends. The official story was clear. The murders appeared to be revenge killings, crimes of passion carried out by a grieving mother and father. But the deeper they dug, the less they understood about the true motives behind the killings. There was no clear evidence of who had truly orchestrated the deaths, and no one could answer why the brutal acts had been carried out in such a symbolic manner. No one knew the full truth. No one except Jerome and Tiffany. The truth of Aiden's suffering. The years of bullying he had endured in silence, the desperation he felt, and the dreams of revenge he had poured into his journal. No one knew about the journal, about the twisted fantasy Aiden had written down as a way to cope with his pain. No one understood the psychological toll that had led to this point. They only saw the violence, the brutality, the aftermath. But even as the police closed in and the town wrestled with its divided views of justice, the truth was slowly being erased, buried in the rubble of what had already been done. Aiden's suffering had ended with his death, and Jerome and Tiffany, had become prisoners of their own making, trapped in a nightmare that would never let them wake up. No one would ever fully comprehend the cost of their actions, not just on the victims, but on themselves. And in the end, no amount of revenge could bring Aiden back. Story 3. The detectives stormed the house with a precise goal. They move fast, methodical, as if time is running out. They can feel it now, the unease creeping in, the sensation that something is hidden, something crucial just out of sight. It's when they reach the master bedroom and the officer pulls out a small, worn notebook from beneath the bed that the real questions begin. This is where the truth could be waiting. This is where the lies could unravel. June 3rd, 2022. It was a Tuesday morning in Mariner's Bluff. The kind of morning where the mist clings to the water and the air smells like salt on wet wood. People were out walking their dogs, joggers making their usual rounds, seagulls picking through yesterday's scraps. Nothing felt out of place, except for the empty dock. Hannah Brooks and her 9-year-old daughter, Journey, had set out the previous day on a fishing trip, a girls-only outing that had become their summer tradition. Friends said Hannah was excited, a little tense maybe, but determined to make memories with her daughter. The kind of memories she felt slipping away as her marriage to Darius grew more strained that morning. Darius stood at the edge of the dock, eyes fixed on the horizon. The tide was higher than usual, churning with the remnants of yesterday's storm. In his hand, a single fishing rod harness. He said he'd found it washed ashore, tangled in seaweed. The line snapped. No boat, no body. No sign of his wife or daughter. Authorities were called, and soon patrol boats combed the waters. Helicopters hovered overhead. The Coast Guard issued a statement. A small vessel, matching the description of Hannah's boat, was found in pieces, drifting miles away near the Outer Banks. But what they didn't find was more unsettling than what they did. Darius stood by, eyes red, voice shaking, clutching that fishing rod like a lifeline. He told them it was just a fishing trip, a harmless afternoon that went wrong. He said Hannah knew how to handle a boat. He said Journey was a strong swimmer. But he didn't say why Hannah and Journey went out in a storm. He didn't say why he wasn't with them. Neighbors began to gather, whispering behind cupped hands. Mariner's Bluff is a town where people know each other's business, where gossip spreads quicker than high tide. And as search crews continued scouring the water, a crowd formed at the dock. Some came to help, others just to watch. They huddled together, eyes darting from the waves to Darius, then back again. A woman in a floral housecoat, arms folded tight, against her chest, muttered to another, "They don't just disappear, not both of them, not like this." Meanwhile, Vanessa Brooks stood alone, away from the crowd, fingers tapping against the screen of her phone. To anyone watching, she seemed lost in thought, maybe grief. But those who knew her said she looked distracted. And when someone asked where she'd been when her sister and niece went missing, Vanessa only shook her head and said, "I was at work. I had no idea they even left." The search continued into the night, floodlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating patches of the churning sea. And as each hour passed, hope ebbed away like the receding tide. By morning, all they had was the fishing rod, a few scraps of the boat, and 2 names added to the missing persons list. 2 days later, a closed casket memorial was held at Mariner's Bluff Community Church. The congregation sang hymns. The preacher spoke of life's unpredictability, and Darius wept into his hands as the choir sang Amazing Grace. Vanessa sat in the front row, eyes dry, hands folded neatly in her lap. Afterward, while mourners filed out and the organist played soft, somber chords, a group of Hannah's friends gathered in the parking lot. One of them, a childhood friend named Mara, said Hannah had called her the night before the trip, said she was scared, said she'd found out something terrible, something that could tear her family apart. But before Mara could explain, Vanessa appeared behind them. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes fixed on Mara. Mara said nothing. The other women looked down, and Vanessa walked away, a slight smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Days passed, then weeks. The ocean gave nothing back. The town tried to move on, but questions lingered. Why did Hannah go out alone in a storm? Why didn't anyone see Journey leave the house? And why was Darius seen at a bar miles down the coast, laughing and dancing with Vanessa, the very night his wife and daughter went missing? Hannah Brooks was the kind of woman people in Mariners Bluff trusted, raised in the same town where she eventually started her own family. She was the eldest daughter of a devout, church-going family, soft-spoken and kind-hearted. She worked as a receptionist at a pediatric clinic, balancing her job with being a full-time mother to her daughter, Journey. For Hannah, family was everything. She was the type to bring casseroles to neighbors, volunteer for church events, and organize birthday parties with homemade cupcakes and handwritten invitations. But behind closed doors, her life was far from picture perfect. Journey Brooks was 9 years old, a bright and curious little girl with big eyes and an infectious laugh. She was the kind of child who asked too many questions and made friends easily. At school, she was known as the girl who could make anyone smile. But at home, Journey had become more withdrawn in recent months, her eyes often lingering on the door, waiting for her father to come home. She loved to draw, filling notebooks with crayon sketches of boats and lighthouses, a world she said she wanted to explore someday. For Journey, her mother was her world, her protector, the only constant in a home that felt increasingly unpredictable. Darius Brooks wasn't born in Mariners Bluff. He came from Charleston, looking for a fresh start. When he met Hannah, he was committed to building a better life. Though he had a low-paying secretary job, he worked hard and did his best to provide for his new family. He wasn't wealthy, but he was responsible, and he loved his wife and daughter deeply. To the outside world, Darius may have seemed like a man trying to stay afloat, but to Hannah, he was the man she believed in and stood by. Despite the challenges, Vanessa Brooks was the younger sister, the one who always seemed to live in Hannah's shadow, while Hannah was the dependable, responsible older sibling who stayed in Mariners Bluff. Vanessa was the wild one, the pretty one, the one who couldn't seem to stay in one place for too long. She was the girl who always had a new boyfriend, a new job, a new excuse for why she couldn't quite get her life together. Barely 24 hours. After Hannah and Journey were declared missing, Darius was seen partying and drinking with Vanessa. A bartender named Lyle, who served them that night, later told police, "I remember thinking, man, that guy's wife and kid are missing, and he's in here drinking shots and dancing like it's a celebration." 1 month later, when Darius and Vanessa walked hand in hand into the county courthouse, smiling like newlyweds, the whispers turned to shouts. Mariners Bluff had lost a mother and daughter to the sea, but now they were about to lose their illusions about Darius and Vanessa, because that marriage wasn't just a vow. It was a declaration that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The investigation was still ongoing. In the background, Darius and Vanessa were the primary suspects, and the police wasted no time in inviting them for investigation. Inside the dimly lit station, Detective Sharon Liu was sifting through Vanessa's phone records. Most of her text messages had been deleted, but a forensic tech had managed to recover fragments from her WhatsApp account. 2 texts stood out. The first, "After she gone, it's just us." The second, "You better handle it clean, Tyrone. I did my part at the office." Detective Liu read the messages aloud, her eyes narrowing. "After she'd gone," she muttered, rolling the words over in her mind. The language was casual, almost flippant. Not the way someone talks about a sister and a niece who vanished at sea, But it was the second message that sent a chill down her spine. The one about Tyrone and handling it clean. Lou grabbed a marker and wrote the words on the whiteboard, drawing a line from Vanessa's name to Tyrone Masoner, man whose name was already on their radar. Tyrone Mason, ex-con, former dockhand, a man with a history of violence and a connection to Vanessa that was becoming harder to ignore. Detective Lou pulled up Tyrone's financial records. That's when she saw it. A $20,000 cash deposit made 3 days before Hannah and Journey's disappearance. The source, Darius Brooks. The reason, blank. Lou's jaw clenched. $20,000 in cash. No explanation. No paper trail. Just a transfer from Darius's account to Tyrone's days before Hannah and Journey set sail. Detective Wiggins joined Lou in the evidence room, his eyes scanning the board. $20,000, Lou said, tapping the printout. What was it? For a... Wiggins shook his head, staring at the timeline laid out before them. The footage of Darius and Vanessa partying the night of the disappearance. The text from Vanessa's phone. The cash deposit to Tyrone. It was all there in black and white. And yet, when questioned, Darius swore he was home the night of the storm, pacing the living room, calling out to God to bring his family back. But the footage told a different story. Darius and Vanessa were at the bar until 2 a.m., laughing, drinking, dancing. At one point, Vanessa pulled Darius onto the dance floor, their bodies pressed close, her head resting against his shoulder, his hands gripping her waist. They didn't look like people whose loved ones had just vanished. They looked like people celebrating. Outside the station, the media frenzy was growing. Reporters gathered in clusters, shoving microphones toward anyone who walked through the door. Why did Darius and Vanessa get married so quickly? One reporter shouted, his voice echoing through the parking lot. Did Vanessa benefit from the insurance payout? Another called out, flashing a camera in Detective Wiggins's face. Inside the house, Darius and Vanessa now shared. The blinds were drawn, the curtains pulled tight. Neighbors walked by, glancing up at the darkened windows, whispering to one another. Theories spread through Mariner's Bluff like wildfire. What started as whispers around coffee tables and church pews soon became the talk of town. Was it an accident? Did Hannah and Journey really get caught in a storm that fateful afternoon? The boat capsizing, dragging them both down into the churning sea. It was a story that was easy to believe. Mariner's Bluff had seen its share of tragedies at sea. Boats going under, men overboard, lives lost to unpredictable waters. But 2 people, a mother and her child, both disappearing without a trace, that was harder to swallow. And then there was the fact that the storm warnings hadn't been severe that day. Weather reports indicated gusty winds and choppy waves, but nothing strong enough to capsize a boat. Fishermen who had been out that morning said the waters were rough but navigable, and Hannah wasn't new to boating. She grew up on the water, learning to fish from her father, steering a boat before she could ride a bike. People began to wonder why an experienced boater like Hannah would head out to sea with her daughter in conditions that others deemed risky. Was she really that reckless, or did someone make her believe it was safe to go? The other theory was darker, more deliberate. Did Darius and Vanessa plan it all? There was the insurance payout, $1 million, filed by Vanessa just weeks before. The trip? There was surveillance footage of Darius and Vanessa at the bar, laughing, dancing, drinking, while search crews scoured the water for Hannah and Journey. There was Vanessa's quick transition from grieving sister to blushing bride, walking down the courthouse steps with Darius just a month after the memorial service. People in town started connecting the dots. Was the fishing trip just a cover? Did Darius and Vanessa conspire to get rid of Hannah and Journey for the money? And if they did, why didn't they wait? Why the rush to collect the insurance money? To get married, to move on? Vanessa's role in all of this remained murky. Was she the mastermind, using her sister's death to cash in on the insurance and trap Darius in a marriage he never wanted? Or was she just a pawn, a woman caught between two men, one who wanted her love and one who wanted her silence? As the investigation continued, Tyrone was brought in for questioning. He sat across from Detective Wiggins, his eyes darting to the one-way mirror, sweat glistening on his brow. When asked where he was the day of the fishing trip, Tyrone claimed he was home, nursing a hangover, watching TV, but his phone records told a different story. Tyrone's phone pinged near the docks that morning, around the time Hannah and Journey were setting out to sea. And there was another ping 2 hours later from a spot 20 miles south, the same area where the boat wreckage was found. When confronted with the cash withdrawals, Tyrone shifted in his seat, his leg bouncing beneath the table. "I don't know nothing about that," he said, eyes downcast. But when detectives mentioned Vanessa's text, "You better handle it clean, Tyrone." "I did my part at the office." Tyrone's jaw clenched, his fists tightening in his lap. He looked up at the ceiling, took a deep breath, and said, "She set me up. That money wasn't payment, it was a loan. Darius owed me money. Vanessa told me to ask him for it." The confession was shaky, filled with half-truths and contradictions. Tyrone claimed he had nothing to do with the disappearance, that Vanessa was pulling the strings, that he was just the fall guy. But when asked why he was seen near the docks that morning, Tyrone's story fell apart. "I was meeting Vanessa," he said. "She told me to wait there, said she had something for me." Detectives weren't buying it. Tyrone's alibi was weak, and his involvement was clear. But was he the mastermind, or was he covering for someone else? Back at the station, Detective Wiggins stared at the evidence board, his eyes tracing the lines connecting Vanessa, Darius, and Tyrone. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 versions of the truth. But somewhere in the middle, between the lies and the money and the missing boat, the real story was waiting to be uncovered, and it was about to surface. Meanwhile, things were already taking another turn. In their house, Darius was growing suspicious of Vanessa and her pregnancy. The night Vanessa told him she was pregnant, he'd felt a surge of guilt, a pang of regret. But as the weeks went on, as Vanessa's belly grew, something started gnawing at him, a nagging doubt that kept him up at night. The dates didn't add up. The timing felt wrong. Darius remembered the day Vanessa told him she was pregnant, the way she said it, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. He remembered how she clutched his hand, how she said it was going to bring them closer, how she said it would make them a real family. But Darius started doing the math, counting back the days, and that's when it hit him. The baby wasn't his. Darius confronted Vanessa in the kitchen, his fists clenched, his jaw set. "Whose baby is it?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. Vanessa looked away, her eyes darting to the window, to the front door, to anywhere but Darius's face. "It's yours," she said, her voice shaking. "You know it's yours." But Darius wasn't buying it. "I saw you with Tyrone," he said, stepping closer, his breath hot against her face. "I saw you slipping out of his car. I saw you in the alley behind the bar." Vanessa swallowed hard, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "It's yours," she repeated, her voice weaker now, less certain. Darius grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're lying," he said. "You've been lying to me since the beginning." Vanessa wrenched herself free, stumbling backward, her eyes wide. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice rising. "You're crazy." Darius shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "No," he said, stepping back, his eyes cold. "You are." The next day, Darius moved out of their shared home and filed for an annulment. This was just 3 months after their marriage. That same week, the police arrived at the house with a warrant in hand, the early morning light casting long shadows across the front lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, blinds drawn, eyes peering through slats as detectives moved through the front door. Detectives moved quickly, rooms searched, drawers emptied, closets rifled through. They moved to the master bedroom, the guest room, the garage. In the corner of the guest room, one officer noticed a small wooden box shoved beneath the bed, half hidden, beneath a pile of clothes. He pulled it out, lifted the lid, and found a notebook, its cover worn, the edges frayed. The name Vanessa was written in blue ink on the first page. Detective Wiggins took the notebook, his gloves squeaking against the pages as he flipped through it. The handwriting was neat, tight, almost obsessive. Page after page, Vanessa had poured out her secrets, her fantasies, her fears. It started with a confession. "I always loved him," she wrote. "From the moment he moved into town, I knew he was mine. But Hannah got to him first." Vanessa described their first kiss. The first time Darius slipped into her room while Hannah was out shopping. The first time he told her he loved her. She wrote about the lies they told Hannah, the excuses they made, the nights spent together. While Hannah sat up alone, waiting for a husband who never came home. "It was supposed to be our secret," Vanessa wrote, "our forever." But then she found out. Hannah had confronted Vanessa with the texts. Vanessa claimed Hannah called her a liar, a backstabber, a bitch. Hannah said she was going to the church. She was going to expose them, said she was going to tell everyone. Vanessa wrote that she and Darius had made a plan to quiet Hannah for life. Take her insurance money, $750,000 for Hannah, and $250,000 for Journey. Go to a new state and start life afresh. Deleted WhatsApp messages retrieved from her phone also show that she sent the following messages to Tyrone earlier on. "I told him to handle it, make it look like an accident, a storm, nobody, no crime." Detectives had also uncovered insurance tampering under South Carolina Code, Section 3855170. Tyrone, Darius, and Vanessa were all arrested. And then came the trials. The courthouse, a small building on the edge of town, was packed with reporters, families, and curious onlookers, all eager to see justice unfold. Vanessa and Darius were charged with conspiracy to commit double homicide, and Tyrone Mason was charged with 2 counts of murder. The charges alone sent shockwaves through the small town, but it was the trial itself that revealed the ugly truth behind the Brooks family's unraveling. In the courtroom, Darius sat quietly, his hands folded. In his lap, his eyes focused on the table in front of him. His defense team tried to paint him as a victim of Vanessa's manipulation, a man who had been deceived by his wife's sister, who had been led astray by lies and promises of a better life. They claimed Darius never intended for anyone to get hurt. He loved his family, they argued. He had nothing to do with the murders, but the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the surveillance footage, showing Darius and Vanessa laughing and drinking. Just hours after the disappearance of Hannah and Journey, they showed the messages from Vanessa's phone, the ones where she spoke of handling it clean and making sure Tyrone took care of things. They revealed Darius's involvement in the financial transactions with Tyrone, the $20,000 that had been paid to him just days before the trip. They laid out the sequence of events that led to the disappearance of the Brooks family, and with each new piece of evidence, the picture became clearer. Darius had been involved, whether he liked it or not. Vanessa's trial was equally intense. Her defense tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Tyrone, that she had been trapped in a relationship with a man who had control over her. They claimed Vanessa never meant for things to go this far, that she never intended for Hannah and Journey to die. But the prosecution was not buying it. They painted her as the mastermind, the one who pulled the strings from behind the scenes, the one who used her own sister to further her own desires. They presented the diary, the one Vanessa had kept, filled with details of her affair with Darius, her plans to eliminate Hannah, and her betrayal of her own flesh and blood. Vanessa's face was unreadable throughout the trial. She never seemed to show remorse, never seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of what she had done. Tyrone's trial was the most brutal. He had no defense. His confession, though filled with contradictions, was enough to seal his fate. Tyrone admitted to following the Brooks boat that morning, to disabling the engine, and to dumping the bodies at sea. He had been promised money, a large sum, and he had been told that once the job was done, he could disappear, free of any responsibility. His motivation was simple: greed. Tyrone didn't care about Darius or Vanessa. He cared about the payout. And when the storm hit, he saw his opportunity. The prosecution showed his history of illegal activities, his ties to the criminal underworld, and the fact that he had been paid handsomely for his role in the murders. It was clear that Tyrone wasn't just a pawn in a twisted game. He was an active participant, a willing accomplice who had played his part in the murders with chilling precision. The emotional statements from Hannah's family members added a heavy weight to the courtroom. Hannah's parents, sitting in the front row, their eyes red from crying, spoke of their daughter's kindness, her love for her family, and how she had always dreamed of giving Journey a better life. They spoke of the pain of losing her, of not knowing what had really happened, and of the betrayal they felt when they learned of the role Vanessa had played in their daughter's death. Journey's aunt, Hannah's sister, spoke of the child's bright spirit, of how she had been robbed of a future, of how she would never see her niece's laughter again. The room was heavy with grief, the weight of the loss felt by everyone who had known the Brooks family. The sentencing was swift, but it didn't bring closure. Darius was sentenced to life in prison, his plea for leniency rejected by the judge. Vanessa was given a similar sentence, though her lack of emotion throughout the trial led many to question whether she truly understood the severity of what she had done. Tyrone was sentenced to death, his actions deemed unforgivable by the court. While in prison, a DNA test was conducted, and it was confirmed that the baby is actually But what kind of life will the child grow up to? What will he be told about his parents? Mariner's Bluff would never be the same. The town had lost more than just 2 lives. It had lost its sense of trust, its sense of safety, and its faith in the people it had once held dear. The shockwaves of the murders reverberated through the community, and though time would eventually heal the wounds, the scars would remain forever. For the people of Mariner's Bluff, justice had been served, but at what cost? In a web of lies, sometimes the most convincing storytellers are the ones who believe their own deceptions. Vanessa had spun a story for herself, a story in which she was not just a victim of circumstance, but a woman who took control of her fate, no matter the cost. To her, Darius wasn't just a man caught in her web. He was a partner, a willing participant in her plans. She convinced herself that she was doing the right thing, that taking out her sister and her niece was the only way to secure a future for herself, to get everything she had ever wanted. And Darius, so consumed by his own insecurities and guilt, bought into that story, allowing himself to believe the lies she fed him, the story that made him think he was the victim in all of this. They both built a world around them where the truth was a distant concept, one that they manipulated to fit their desires. But the problem with living in a lie is that eventually reality has a way of breaking through. Darius may have believed that the affair with his wife's sister was justified, that the lies Vanessa had crafted were simply part of the game they played. But when the storm hit, when the boat went under, and when their plans finally unraveled, the truth could no longer be ignored. In the end, it wasn't just the betrayal of a spouse or a sibling that destroyed them. It was the betrayal of their own selves. The moment Darius realized the baby wasn't his, the realization shattered the fragile world they had built. The guilt of knowing what they had done to Hannah, to Journey, to themselves, consumed him. For Tyrone, the man who had carried out the physical act of killing, there was no escaping the reality of his own actions. His claim that Vanessa masterminded everything fell on deaf ears. He might have believed that he was simply a pawn in a much larger game, but his role in the deaths of 2 innocent people could not be overlooked. Tyrone had his own demons, his own life full of crime and desperation, but the moment he agreed to follow through with Vanessa's plan, he crossed a line that could never be undone. And when the time came to answer for his actions, there was no turning back. No amount of regret, no amount of pleading could change what he had done. He had played his part, but ultimately it was the lives of Hannah and Journey that paid the price. In the end, this wasn't just a story about murder. It was a story about the darkness that can fester behind the smiles and promises we make to the ones we love. About how easily we can deceive ourselves into thinking that our lies won't catch up to us. It was a cautionary tale about trust, about betrayal, and about the dark side of family loyalty. It was a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most, and that the truth, no matter how hard it is to face, will always find a way to break free from the webs we weave.